When I say that there's an assault on tradition being waged by the modernists running the church, people immediately think of the attempts to uncanonically suppress the traditional Latin Mass in the Latin rite of the church. They think that for good reason, too, as that issue most frequently gets reported by those of us who love the Mass of the Ages. The stories about the slaves of the Immaculate Heart, the friars of the Immaculate Conception, or the overt suppression of the Mass in Italy by Italian bishops makes clear that suppressing the Latin Mass is a high priority for these people. But this assault on tradition goes much further than merely the assault on the traditional Mass, as horrifying as that is. We've seen an attack on all things Catholic due to the enthronement of a satanic philosophy, situational ethics, which has been condemned by nearly every preconciliar pope going back to at least 100 years before the Second Vatican Council. The assault continues today and may be coming to a head. We're going to have a look at that. But before we get started, I wanted to continue to make the call for submissions to the blog, returntotradition.org. I can't offer payment for submissions at this time, but the blog does get hundreds of hits each day, so feel free to submit your art, poetry, opinion pieces, or reflections via email. A link is in the description. Also, by popular request, I have a P.O. box, so you can send real mail. Send your hate mail, bricks, prayer cards, or whatever to the address in the description of this video. Finally, if you want to support the work of this channel, you can do so for as little as $1 each month on Patreon and Subscribestar. As always, a special thank you to the patrons of this channel. Now, on to the news. If you want to know what heretical ideas are up next for normalizing in the church, we all know that if Pastor Jimmy Martin of the Jesuit Church hasn't opened his mouth to advocate for a terrible idea that leads souls to hell, then the German bishops are the next best source for information. The same is true for us today. Bishop Franz Josef Overbeck, the ordinary of Germany's Essen diocese, told reporters that the October Synod in Rome will lead to a break in the church, that nothing will be the same as it was. On the agenda, the hierarchical structure of the church, sexual morality, the ontological reality of the priesthood, and, to quote the bishop, the role of women in the church, which is modernist code for women's ordination. The Synod will take place October 6th through 27th, and its primary themes are ecology, theology and pastoral care, the concerns of indigenous peoples, and human rights. Of course, always human rights. Pastoral care is another code word for being able to make sweeping changes in theology and to enable ignoring the laws of nature regarding morality. It's the same excuse used by various Christian sects for allowing divorce and remarriage, regardless of what our blessed Lord had to say on the matter. And it's going to be used again and again to drive faithful Catholics underground so that the modernists can complete their work of remaking the church in their own demonic image. This quote from LifeSite is instructive. Quote, "Slated for removal from the church is her Eurocentric structure," Overbeck promised, saying the local churches in Latin America and their clergy would become increasingly independent. Meanwhile, reflecting on the priest shortage in both Europe and Latin America, the Bishop of Essen declared that the local churches are already mainly run by women religious. "The face of the local church is female," Overbeck said. End quote. That's reassuring, isn't it? Imagine an entire continent of parishes run by Susan from the Parish Council clones, and you get a picture of what the modernists want. They also intend to look into the declining numbers of Catholics in South and Central America, not realizing that at least one of the drivers of this decline is the increased effeminacy of Catholicism, as it has been presented since the Council. Nothing cures an effeminate priesthood and modernized faith quite like letting strong, independent women run the parishes, right? And to be clear, we're not talking about the same women who volunteer to do the menial administrative tasks in many parishes. We're talking about parish governance itself, where vocations have collapsed, leading one priest being available for several parishes at a time. Often women are hired to run these parishes, which seems to be increasingly the state of things pretty much anywhere you go in the world now, save for cultures that have rejected feminism. This bishop is a known homosexualist and wants to change the church's teaching on sodomy and the rest of it. We know his type well. I mean, he is a German hypermodernist, so that gives you an idea. Back in February, New Ways Ministry, that favorite group of Pastor Jimmy Martin's that has been condemned repeatedly by Rome, sang Bishop Overbeck's praises due to his open calls for changing the church's teaching on same-sex attraction. The bishop wrote a proposal that New Ways Ministry and other dissident media outlets picked up and ran with, where he laid his case for heterodoxy out in the open. It's an astonishing series of statements he made to the media. Here are some excerpts. A statement he gave to LaCroix on what he is proposing is especially instructive, and I quote, "In recent years, the many conversations I have had with individual gay people have touched me, given me food for thought, and have widened my perspective on the issue of homosexuality. It is high time for the Church to conduct the debate on the perception and appraisal of homosexuality in such a way that the barely healed scars of past wounds are not once again torn open." Bishop Overbeck said there is at this moment almost no other issue quite as capable of stirring up emotions in the Catholic Church as the appraisal of homosexuality. It is therefore both crucial and urgent that the Church address this issue more deeply, he said. This particularly applies to homosexuality because, according to this assumption, such a negative Church view as that expressed in Church teaching has promoted and encouraged a psychologically and institutionally unhealthy repression or even denial of this expression of sexuality. One thing is certain, every human being can most respectfully and lovingly enter into personal relationships. Excluding certain groups is therefore the expression of a prejudice which is hard to bear for those excluded and in the final instance leads to the discriminating against or even criminalizing them. End quote. Man, I bet the people of Sodom and Gomorrah felt the same way. Notice what he's doing there. His change of heart comes from a personal experience of meeting with a person or persons with deeply set, intrinsically disordered vices, whatever a personal experience means in this case. I've said repeatedly that this issue in particular, that of sexual morality and the defense of those moral norms against the normalization of those sins that cry to heaven for vengeance like this one, are a litmus test for determining the orthodoxy overall of a particular prelate. In this case, the same bishop who said that after the Amazonian Synod in Rome is concluded, life in the Church will be very different because everything regarding hot-button issues will have changed, is also a known advocate for the Rainbow Coalition. Imagine my shock indeed. So when he says that the Church must rethink its stance on same-sex attraction and activity, we shouldn't be surprised when he says, quoting that same New Ways Ministry propaganda piece again, quote, "In rethinking homosexuality, the bishop said the Church must include people's experiences of human sexuality as well as the findings of contemporary science on the issue in its ethical reflection," he said. "That is the only way tradition will remain a living process as it has been since the beginnings of Christianity." Overbeck pointed to Vatican II's document Gaudium et Spes, of course, as a pathway forward. He cited the document's section 36, which notes that the humble and persevering investigators of the secrets of nature are being led, as it were, by the hand of God. In a final note, Overbeck rejected the idea that gay priests were a cause of the present clergy sexual abuse scandal, saying that the suggestion they were is downright absurd and would only further that attitude which has led to problematic interchurch repressions, which actually caused such abuse. End of quote. Of course, he rejects the statistical data that shows there's a correlation in the strongest possible terms between a link between priests suffering same-sex attraction and the abuse of minors. But notice what he said here, that the faith must be the slave of science, which is actually always changing, and that tradition must be the subject to people's experiences. Recall, if you've been here a little while, that the live stream I did with Classical Theist in February, where we talked about modernism and explained Pope Pius X's encyclical Pascendi in terms relevant to normal people. Bishop Overbeck is a textbook modernist, and here openly states that vital immanence should be the guiding principle of tradition. They're not even hiding their heresy anymore. In the end, the goal of these modernists is to make the true Catholic faith, bury it forever, and to keep the brand of Catholicism with its trappings of art, smells, bells, and the rest, but to use it to promote a new religion that isn't Catholic in the slightest. They seek a new religion, one without hard and fast rules for almost anything really, one that walks in near perfect accord with the secular world. Only by fully betraying Christ in the way they seek to will the Church remain relevant in the world, and only then will the Church be able to lead the world to salvation. If that doesn't make any sense to you, don't worry, you're not insane. They only believe in a material salvation at best. I mean, why the need for salvation if there is a reasonable hope that all or most men are saved? that even militant atheists go to heaven, that all religions worship the same deity in a culturally relative way. Salvation becomes a political expression, that is, the realization of certain goals where secular social justice is dressed up in the garb of the Catholic Church. If this all sounds provocative to you, and if you think what I'm driving at is that I believe a schism is coming, you'd not be wrong. More sober voices than I have heavily implied the same thing lately. In a video over on the Tumblr House channel, the great Catholic historian Charles Coulombe, in his typically sober way, heavily hinted at Francis inflicting ordained deaconesses on the church in the coming months. And he practically said outright that if Francis did do that, then there would be a formal schism in the church. If that does come to pass, will prelates act? The present crisis in the church is not of Francis's making. If you look soberly at the events from the 60s through today, the church has been in a state of deep crisis this entire time. It's there for anyone who really wants to see it. I'll be presenting a live stream in the coming days to go over this crisis in detail with a couple of guests. Watch for an announcement for the date and time. If you want a hint at what that crisis looks like, watch this ending clip. It's from an Easter Mass somewhere. God bless, and pray for the church.